Coming up, we're going to talk to Corey Leff, John Wall Street. You know him. You love him. One of the best sports business guys out there, at the vanguard of breaking news. And now let's bring on Corey Leff, founder of John Wall Street and Howie Longshort and Sports Illustrated. The guy's everywhere. He's breaking stuff every damn day. If you're not following him, you should be, because if you're not informed. Corey, I can't thank you enough for hopping on. Thank you.
No, thanks for having me. And it's funny you're talking about Rockhurst, because I actually root for the arch rival Shawnee Mission East. My cousin is a lacrosse coach over there.
The Lancers.
The Lancers.
I know exactly what you're talking about. Wow, that's amazing.
So I know all about the rivalry, and I'm a big Shawnee Mission guy, and proudly wearing my Carolina blue.
So yeah, and that is their colors. Those are the Shawnee Mission East colors. So what a day to have you on, by the way, because we were going to have you on earlier in the week, but it turns out this big Barstool thing explodes. What's going on with Barstool Sports?
Well, Barstool Sports just drew a huge number for a company that started out as a gambling rag. Pretty impressive.
When you look at the whole thing of Penn Gaming, I mean, what is Penn Gaming and what is this relationship? How did this, you think, come about, and what's the reason for it? Because I think a lot of people might look at Barstool and granted, it is a lot of gambling, and that's not a coincidence, but that has only gone on the increase when it comes to Barstool content. So why is a gambling company, a gaming company, buying Barstool Sports?
Well, first, let's start with what is Penn. Penn National Gaming is one of the largest regional gaming operators. But the fact that you're asking me what Penn Gaming is, means that it's not kind of top of mind for gamblers around the country. They're in 21 or something states, so they have a large presence, and there'll be a large opportunity for cross-branding with the Barstool brand. Asking why this makes sense in terms of an acquisition, simply put, people don't know who they are, like you just explained, and it's expensive to run the marketing and advertising campaigns that FanDuel and DraftKings have done over the last couple of years. And simply, even at $450 million, or a valuation at $450 million, they paid 163 or something, plus some stock. But it's just, even at that number, it's still sensible to try to buy than build.
I think there's probably people out there like me who see that number and they're like, okay, 450 million. Why is Barstool? What is it about Barstool? Do they have this ginormous built-in audience, all the subscribers is it the personality driven stuff? Why is it worth that amount of money?
Well, I have a hard time getting to the number. I don't know exactly what multiple they use to get to that number. I mean, the Washington Post sold for $250 million. So, I don't know how they got to the number, to be honest with you. But yes, it is a very valuable brand, even though it's not a profitable brand. They do, I think, something like $100 million in revenue, but it's just a break-even company. But what it is it does have a loyal followership. And the idea here is that, or the belief that Penn has, is that they can convert those loyal fans into the players on their mobile applications and in their casinos.
We're visiting with Corey Leff, John Wall Street. Of course, you know who he is, Sports Illustrated, and he's out front on the breaking news, the inside information. He really does a great job on Twitter. And it's Howie Longshort. Is that right? On Twitter. One word. Right. You need to be following this. I've been following you forever. By the way, before we get into something else, since this is the first time we've had you on, give us a little background on yourself and how you got into this and what it is that you do if people don't know.
Sure. So I started my career in sports talk radio. That's really what I wanted to do. I quickly found out that the game isn't nearly as exciting as what's going on behind the game. I spent
what are you talking about? This is unbelievable.
It can be, but I spent 2 summers in Arizona when the Diamondbacks lost 100 games. I mean, it was Randy Johnson winning once a week, and Brandon Webb might win once every other week.
And you're a Wildcat guy. You're an Arizona Wildcat, right?
I'm a big Wildcat guy. I don't want to talk Arizona basketball 12 months of the year like they do in Tucson, as much as I love the program. And so I spent a whole bunch of time in the startup space. I spent a bunch of time in equity research and institutional sales. And actually, that's kind of what led me to the John Wall Street concept. Initially, the idea for John Wall Street was to make it content marketing to sell equity research. Kevin Durant tears his Achilles, Madison Square Garden Networks drops by 8%. I can write you a little blurb about why those two things are tied together and sell you an equity research report. I think that's still a good model. But what I've built is an audience of super influential people within the sports world. It's team owners, it's league commissioners, media heads, and agency heads. It's not necessarily your institutional investor that's buying equity research. So most of the content I write is not focused on a stock, but while we are talking about Penn National Gaming, which is publicly traded, the stock's up 13% today. So it is clear that the stoolies are buying it up. I'm not sure what the gaming industry necessarily thinks of it.
It's fascinating, though, in the space that you're in, how dynamic it is, how seemingly it is growing, but it's growing in certain ways. And the value of, and nobody can speak to this better than I can over the last 15 years or so, the value of proprietary information in sports, to me, is one of the great underrated, underserved things in business in general now because of the advent of gambling. When you just look at point spreads, if you've got proprietary information, sure, it's breaking news on Twitter, but it's much more than that. So where do you think, in particular, gambling is going to have an impact on sports? Because I've been a little underwhelmed so far by its impact.
Yeah, I don't know. Sports Business Journal put out a piece earlier in the week that basically said TV ratings have not been impacted in the states where sports betting is legal. And I'm not surprised to see that. For the ratings to increase, you would be talking about people that would not otherwise be watching games tuning in. I never thought that would be the case. I think where you're going to see, the biggest impact is on the sponsorship and advertising end. I had a conversation earlier in the week. It actually will be in the piece I'm writing for tomorrow, which is kind of a gambling recap or kind of update, setting the table as to where we are, particularly as it relates to mobile and online gambling. But we were talking about how it's realistic to think that next year is the first time where we could see a national Super Bowl ad from a gaming company, because there could be enough states that have betting to make it worthwhile.
It's funny you bring up sponsorships, and I couldn't agree with you more. And I don't know if you were around at this point, but when I was first starting Sports by Brooks in the first 4 or 5 years, the biggest thing was to be able to get, from my business perspective, was to be able to get gambling ads, to be able to get offshore. Yep. And of course, no, this is a kind of quasi against the law. We're not really sure, but you shouldn't be doing it. But that was a gold rush. Sure. That was a gold mine. And I thought that was what was going to happen when we came back to it, but it hasn't happened so far. Do you think that could, we're seeing the NFL jump in head first. Could that explode eventually, or is it going to be incremental, or is it going to be static, that growth when it comes to gambling sponsorship?
To be honest, I don't know the answer to that. I think it'll be gradual. The leagues have kind of tipped their toes into it. You haven't seen, in a league like the NBA, there's no gambling patch sponsors, or, right. In MLS, I don't think you're going to see that on
That's going to happen, though.
At some point, sure, absolutely. And that's where the big dollars come in. I think everybody's kind of just still feeling it out. And again, not every state, without it being legal in every state, there's limited upside in a lot of television media type sponsorships. So, I think it will continue to gradually increase. But I don't know that we're ever going to get to the point where, people kind of think that sports betting is the next big revenue stream in sports. And I'm not sure that I believe that's the case.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. I think one of the reasons is this weird, and it's like weed out here in California. Okay, it's legal, but for a long time it was, but it wasn't. It's the feds. It's the same damn thing.
Yep.
If you lived around the country, and it's kind of the theater of the absurd, and that's probably what's preventing that gold rush. In the past, when that big money was out there for little websites like me, it was based on, okay, we all agree you shouldn't be doing this. We all agree that it's shady. Now, some of us agree that, but some of us now tell, it's okay. It's fine. The Supreme Court said it was. So that, I think that's a big part of it. There's a lack of certainty. We're visiting with Corey Leff, John Wall Street, Sports Illustrated, Howie Longshort on Twitter, all one word. Let's move over to the Super Bowl and let's talk about, I'm a Kansas City guy, and I've been hearing 180-degree reports about, okay, because it's the Chiefs and this is a legacy situation happened to the Super Bowl since 1901, there's going to be a very high ticket price. And then I'm hearing people saying, well, it's going to be a pro Niners crowd. The vast majority of fans in Miami are going to be 49er fans. Just in general, you don't have to answer those questions, but what are you hearing? Give us a little overview of the ticketing situation this year.
Yeah, so tickets are, ranging. Get in for lower bowl is looking at like 6,000, 6,500. In the upper bowl, you can get in for around 5,000, which is a lot closer than you might otherwise expect. But the reason for that dynamic is because Kansas City fans are budget conscious, and they are buying up the cheaper tickets a lot of times. I wrote a story back in bowl season. The reason that bowls have trouble selling tickets is because people who make these trips and are going to spend thousands of dollars on a vacation tend to spend a few extra bucks and buy the good seats. Kansas City fans aren't doing that, which is kind of helping, or it's kind of keeping those two price points relatively close.
Boy, that's interesting. And that leads me to, and as you'll find out if you spend enough time with me, I'm like a bedrock, make no assumptions, master of the obvious kind of guy. And when I look at, and it's not like I just woke up to this, but just since I moved to LA in 20 years, when I look at the ticket prices of a Lakers game or a Dodgers game, there's a disconnect. There's a disconnect. And yeah, and I'm thinking to myself, well, no, but here's the thing, Corey, nobody ever says it's absurd. What? It's like we got to invest your whole life savings, be a Dodger fan now. And there's a lot of psychological things going on with the media and marketing and all that stuff. And I think cord cutting and the cable company and distributors that get involved with the Dodgers as a situation that you would look at why the ticket prices are so high, but why people pay them, because they're being bombarded by the cable companies who are fighting for their lives. So they want you to believe this is normal. But to me, it's not normal. Just what are your thoughts on tickets right now? Just it's a really, really difficult question, I know, but an overview of it, because what you said about Kansas City, I really believe if you're watching this from Los Angeles right now, you're saying, what? They can't afford it. That's kind of not a concept that exists here in LA. So give us an overview of where the ticket business is in general going and where it's at for you.
Well, I want to just back up a second because I got a story from an executive yesterday that I thought, from a high-profile advertising executive, who tells me that, let me back that up even. On Location Experience controls a lot of the Super Bowl tickets, right? So the $6,500 price point that you're seeing on the secondary market, there's a lot of belief that that's kind of artificially inflated, that the NFL keeps the ticket price at that number. And if they can't sell the tickets at $6,500, they'll sell them to their sponsors at face value later.
They'll just eat them.
Well, yeah, they'll sell them to the sponsors. So the sponsor tells me they get a call that the NFL offered them a ticket for $5,000. The ticket, that's the face value on the ticket. And the guy thinks that his contact at the league is scalping him. And obviously he wasn't. That's the face value on the seat. So even high profile CEO level executives at big Fortune 500 companies have sticker shock because the ticket price on the Super Bowl ticket is astronomical. Just generally speaking, you asked, and the LA Times, or I think it was the LA Times who wrote that story, or the Daily News, I forgot who it was, but somebody wrote a story about where the Angels were the only team in the LA market where you could take a family of four to a game, 4 tickets, parking, and like food and beverage for under $100. And that's frankly absurd. I think you're running.
Is this sustainable? Is this sustainable? I'm sorry.
Well, here's the thing. It is sustainable from like at least a business standpoint, like from a dollars and cents standpoint. The leagues feel like they can, even if they sell fewer tickets, the tickets that they're selling are at higher price points, and so we, make more money. The problem is if you don't get kids into the building, how do you build the next generation of fans, and who can afford to take kids to the game if it's going to cost a family of $400? So, or more than $100. So, I think it's a real concern. And so is it sustainable? Probably not long-term. In the short term, though, they'll keep the numbers rising.
You want to hear some amazing, anecdotally, last weekend for a project I'm working on, I went and visited for the very first time in my life. I went to Santa Anita, where you have Seabiscuit and John Henry and all that. And of course the sad, tragic situation involving the death forces lately, but it was a typical day. It cost $5 to get in.
Yeah.
And parking is free at
Beautiful.
Santa Anita.
That's amazing. It's frankly, it's offensive to go to a sporting venue and pay $40 or, I mean, I know on the scale of things, that's relatively cheap. I think at Foxborough, it's $80 or $100 to park your car. I mean, I know outside the Coliseum for Chargers and Rams games, it was $100. So yeah, I'm a firm believer in
that. You're saying that gives me faith in humanity. I want you to know that someone who's so deep into it that you can see that.
Yeah, and I will say, if you're going to pull people to a stadium and you're going to charge them $40 to park, and it's going to cost over $100, to bring your family, you better give them something more than the game, because more often than not, the game, you can't control the outcome of the game. If you're going there and basing your experience on whether the team wins or loses, you're going to be disappointed more often than not. You need to be able to give fans an experience, a memory, something that they take away and say, that was great, and they don't forget. I mean, I've been to hundreds of sporting events in my life, and the ones I can remember, you can count on one hand. Right. And that's a problem, right? If you're going to be charging people the numbers that people are asking.
I want to ask you about the NBA here in a second, but I want to just make one quick statement, because you made an interesting statement about if you don't get kids out to watch these games, what's going to happen to the future of the game. And this is the only observation that I'll make. And it's taken, and I'm not saying that it's right, but when you look at a sport like, let's say, American football, how many adults do we know over the age of 21 playing American football, not for money? They don't exist. For that matter, baseball too, right? And so to me, if a sport exists based on the participation of spectators, not the participation of participants, it's not a sport. It's a spectacle. Yep. And that's what football, American football, is. And to a certain extent, I'm not denigrating it. I'm not saying it's a blood sport like that. No, because baseball is the same thing, So, but you look at a sport like golf, it's different. It's a participatory sport. You don't have to have fans for golf to continue to exist. But if there are no fans or spectators, American football literally does not exist. So yeah. Go ahead.
No, it's worth thinking about. I think it's important to focus on the next generation. You don't want to wake up one day and wonder what happened to this cash cow that we've built, right? So it makes sense to invest in the youth, and I think it certainly, ticket prices is among the biggest problems. There's a stat that I wrote in a story not long ago where, like, kids that attend their first game under the age of 5 are more likely to go to like 75 or 65 or 75% more games per year for the rest of their life than somebody who goes to their first game at 15.
I'm that person.
Yeah. The kid who goes to the game, the kid continues to go to the games throughout the rest of their life. The person who goes to the game in their teenage years or adult years for the first time is not going to go as often, and that's probably because they don't have that connection and those memories. And
So before we let you go, I want to ask you, of course, the great question of the age. For some reason, people always bring it up. And I think there are reasons behind that. That's a whole nother show, but we could certainly have a long chat about it. But the NBA ratings, for some reason, continually come up. And I hate people who, in the course of asking the question, answer it themselves. So I'm not going to do that. NBA ratings. Give me an overview of just your thoughts when you hear those words in the context of the sports business world.
Well, I think it's twofold. One, I think the product is terrible. I think absolutely horrible. If the players don't put any stake in the games, why the heck should the fans?
Now, what do you mean when you say that?
I'm talking about load management is really just what I'm referring to. If
it's
a player,
insulting.
Yeah, it's and just getting back to the ticket price. If you're in a market where you're spending, every market, it costs $100 to go to the game, and it's the one time Giannis is coming into town and Giannis is sitting out on the back end, and you just paid $100 to go watch a bunch of guys that you've never heard of. That's not a great way to keep fans. That's not a good product. I don't think anybody would agree that's a good product. And if NFL players could play 17 weeks or 16 games in 17 weeks, I'm very confused as to why basketball players can't. So generally speaking, I think the product is horrible. But aside from the product being bad, they chose big dollars from ESPN and Turner over the reach of the broadcast television. And you look at other sports, the NFL.
You're talking about cable. You're talking about cable versus over the air.
Cable versus the over the air. So all the, you have cord cutting, which is not a surprise to anyone. All the ESPN, all the NBA's national games are aired on cable. In the NFL, all their national games, with the exception of Sunday Night Football on ESPN, are aired on broadcast television. So it's no surprise that even Major League Baseball, you look at them. Yes, they have they have ESPN and Turner. They also have the Fox deal, though. Hockey, they have an NBC deal. So all the other leagues are playing on broadcast television. The NBA is not, except for a few games that are on ABC. So that's certainly part of it. You have the issue, all the star powers in the West. So the games are being played, the marquee players are playing late at night. People on the East Coast aren't watching them. There's a whole bunch of reasons why NBA ratings are down. But I think it all stems from the fact that the product is bad. What
about streaming? Because when you look at the argument is, I'm not making the argument, but a lot of people will say, who watches a game on linear television? Who sits down and watches a game anymore? Everybody's on either social media, they're on their phone, and we've gotten to the point where maybe this is the tipping point where maybe the NBA ratings aren't that necessarily bad, and we're just misconstruing it because we're behind the curve on streaming and how people consume the games.
Well, I think you hit on something. I don't know that it's not necessarily that the ratings aren't bad, though. I think people are just consuming the game in different ways, shorter formats, highlights. And the NBA, to their credit, it's one of the reasons the league has gotten so successful is they've been so kind of lenient with those rights, right? And allowing people to publish highlights all over the place. But if you can watch a game in 30 seconds that would otherwise take 2.5 hours, that's what today's generation is doing. So I think one of the things you're going to start to see, which is going to be an interesting trend, is rights holders locking down the their highlight packages because
the NBA is already doing that on Twitter.
You're going to start to see that more and more. Cricket, I believe, sold Facebook a highlight package for like $100 million. If that kind of money is flowing for the rights to just highlights, and the big four start cashing in on those deals, Facebook isn't going to allow every other media outlet to just run their highlights. So that's a trend you're going to start to see. You're going to start to see leagues and media outlets and media partners kind of begin to take control over the rights that they have.
Well, that really speaks to, I think, Facebook's commitment to India, the fact that took place, and that's a fascinating sports business story right there, and how it interfaces with Pakistan and the political undertones. One of the more fascinating sports stories out there worldwide. One of the things, and before we let you go, Corey, I wanted to bring this up because you're out front, and I can't encourage you enough to keep covering stories like this, because man, I really love when you're covering things like the Sinclair RSN story.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, and I love Sports Business Daily Journal, but for most people, it's behind a paywall, and you don't get a lot of this in-depth proprietary coverage that you do, not just on that story, but so many other stories. I really appreciate what you do. I just want you to know, number one.
Well, I appreciate that. And just, for the audience who's not familiar, there's a big difference. The SBJ business is built on events. So they're very cognizant of not alienating potential sponsors. So on Wall Street is, our only goal is to provide useful insight to the who's who of the sports world. So we write it right down the middle. Right. And that allows us to have that kind of, allows us to take that, a little bit more leeway in terms of calling it how it is.
Right. You along with Front Office Sports, I think, are at the vanguard of really servicing what has been an underserved audience and opening up a whole new, almost a genre, I think, in sports, and seeing the way sports and what we talked about with the ticket prices. This is way freaking overdue. This should be happening. And I think this is a market reaction to a certain extent. There's opportunity. So it was great to see that you're partnering up with Sports Illustrated. I wanted to ask you before I let you go about the Sinclair situation with the RSNs, because this is a big deal.
Yeah.
I mean, you've got all these RSNs, Fox Sports RSNs. I mean, everybody watching me has an RSN in their market, whatever big city or big region that they're in, doesn't matter. And so what's going on with those RSNs? When is Sinclair going to rebrand them? Are we going to see that by baseball season? Where do we stand with it? What's the future of these RSNs?
I honestly don't know. I would have thought they would have been rebranded already. I thought they were going to be rebranded under the stadium name. I'm not sure that that's not happening, but I would have thought it happened already. They already own the company, and it certainly would.
And they have underlying content that they could make a national network out of right now with the Goodmans and the Shams and all of that.
No question. I'm really not sure. There's the school of thought that they'll end up getting, they'll get Dish back when the local rights expire, and they'll be able to roll the RSNs in there. There's thought, the thought that they'll end up, Comcast will end up renewing their deal and everything will be fine. The question is what happens if those two things don't happen? The company can't be sold for, more than it owes in debt. And it might make sense to just file bankruptcy. I'm not certainly, saying that that's the case that will happen, but I mean, that's kind of the worst case scenario that, the Bears, like Rich Greenfield have stated.
So what you're saying is all of these RSNs going forward, Comcast has said we're dropping them. Dish has said we're dropping them. I mean, they're not.
Dish has dropped the Fox RSNs. Comcast has not, but their deal with Comcast expires this summer. The problem for Comcast, though, is that they own their own set of RSNs. So you run into some antitrust stuff if they say, well, yeah, we're going to continue to, air our RSNs, but cut the Sinclair ones.
So that's good for Sinclair.
That is good for Sinclair. There is a school of thought, though, that Comcast is probably not pleased with the amount of money that they are paying out to their teams for the rights to those broadcast rights. And so if they're able to squeeze Sinclair by cutting Sinclair's, coverage, potentially that could force Sinclair to go back to the teams and renegotiate their deals, which presumably would allow Comcast to do the same. So there is that school of thought that Comcast could play the long game here and squeeze Sinclair and say, fine, we'll only carry our RSNs on 25% of our stations too, and take that hit in the short term and try to renegotiate some of those deals with the teams.
This has to be resolved by opening day in baseball, right? Don't you think?
I don't know. I don't think so. And I certainly don't think that, Marquee will be on Comcast by opening day. That deal doesn't expire until June. So there's no real urgency to get the deal done. Deals typically.
And Marquee is the Cubs, and that's kind of the flagship of what Sinclair's RSNs, you would say?
No, I would say their most prominent RSN is certainly Yes Network. Right. Their stake in Yes Network, but Sinclair, I mean, there's a lot of hope and promise in Marquee, but not having carriage on what is, I think, either the first or second largest, provider in the Chicago area is certainly troublesome.
Outstanding stuff, man. I can't thank you enough. Keep doing it. Keep pushing, man. You've been outstanding today, and we'll keep following you on Twitter and at Sports Illustrated. Congratulations on that deal.
Thanks for having me, Brooks. I really appreciate it. And thanks for reading. And if I can ever be of help to you guys, you know where to find me.
Absolutely. We'll be in touch. That's Corey Leff, John Wall Street. Of course, Howie Long Short on Twitter, all one word. Want you to follow him. He's on Sports Illustrated. He's big time. He's proprietary. He breaks stories. He's got it all locked down, nailed down in sports business. And that's going to do it for today's show.